So let's talk Sin-Skin, Lone Operatives and Murderous Precision Attacks with an overview of the Imperial Assassins in Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd do an overview of the Imperial Assassins in 10th edition Warhammer 40k, talk through their datasheets and the powerful tricks that these black-clad menaces bring to the battlefield, and talk about which ones seem to be seeing most play in competitive army lists, perhaps being a bit more value for the points right now. As with just about everything else in the game, 10th edition has changed things a bit for the Imperial Assassins. In general though, it's pretty easy to add these in to basically any Imperial force, doesn't really cost you any big penalties, and the way it works is that Imperial Agent rules can allow you to take one allied character per 1000 points of your army, usually being an assassin or an inquisitor. In 10th edition, all the assassins have the epic hero keyword, so that means that while you might have been able to run multiple Vindicares or something in previous versions of the game, you can only run one of each of them now should you want to. If you're playing a 2000 point game of Warhammer 40k, that would mean just 2 different assassins if you wanted to take both of them, and none of them are ever allowed to be your warlord. It does mean though that if they're just generally strong, then they're pretty relevant to quite a lot of forces. I feel like Games Workshop often tend to try and make the assassins sort of niche choices that are usable but maybe not auto-include, as otherwise literally every Imperial force would take one. In game, the assassins clock in at between 75 or 115 points depending on the type. They all have lone operative, which means that you can't be shot outside of 12 inches, and they've all got at least some sort of interesting deployment option for getting them into the enemy, whether it's deep strike, infiltrating, or scouting, depending on the assassin in question. At least currently looking at early tournament lists in 10th edition, perhaps the most commonly taken tend to be the Vindicare and the Callidus, for reasons that we'll get onto. It does seem that they seem to be at least relatively competitive, and I'd argue that the other two are at least usable in the right cases. So let's jump straight in then and go through the Assassin's rules one by one. First up we've got the Vindicare, who's 80 points worth of sniping goodness. The Assassins mainly have a fairly standardised profile bar the Eversor perhaps. They move 7 inches, have got a toughness of 4 with a 4+ invulnerable save. As mentioned, lone operative to keep them safe, as that profile isn't really all that tough. Their defensive stat lines will go down pretty quickly if the opponent's able to focus any real might on them. They've got 4 wounds, a leadership of 6, objective control 1. Very much characters that are all about damage and maybe not quite as hard to kill as they might have been in the past sometimes, at least if the enemy can catch up with them with something meaningful and they don't get hit too hard first before they get to hit you. The Vindicare himself also gets infiltrators, so he could forward deploy if he wanted to. I feel like he often might like to be chilling out at the top of a high ruin or something. He could also be kind of interesting for parking on a home field objective as well if he can also have good line of sight from that. As a lone operative, the opponent literally wouldn't be able to clear him with long range guns, so if he could sit on a point while also plinking off characters, then all well and good. But if anything does step up to challenge him, then it's not going to be too hard to take it away from him. He also does have stealth as well, so it means he's a -1 to hit if you do manage to shoot him within 12 inches. Otherwise, for his less exciting stuff, he's got 4 attacks at strength 4 and AP -1 in combat. Could be a little bit of a threat to light infantry, but not really going to be more about that. His main thing is his big sniper rifle, of course. And interestingly enough, he's got the smoke keyword, so in theory you could use that stratagem on him, but realistically you don't want to because he's already got stealth, and the cover save isn't going to make any difference. I guess he'd just be dropping smoke bombs for his own amusement there. Of course, the big deal for him is that massive sniper rifle, and it is pretty threatening. The Exodus rifle gets you a single shot, hitting on a 2+, strength 7, AP 3, and damage D3+3, and that's quite a good damage profile, particularly considering a lot of characters in 10th edition don't have quite as many wounds as they used to in 9th, often being 4 or 5 wounds. If the enemy fails a save against this thing, there's a very good chance he's just going to kill them dead in one shot. It's also got devastating wounds as well. If you happen to luck out and roll a 6 to wound, then that'll be puncturing anything that isn't protection against mortal wounds, could even potentially kill multiple members of a squad that way if he got lucky. He gets to ignore cover with it. He has the heavy keyword, so if he stays still he gets a further +1 to hit, meaning that he'd be a bit resistant to enemy modifiers. And he also of course has the precision keyword, so those saves can be taken on characters first rather than the rest of the squad. Finally, as if that weren't enough, if you also get lucky on the hit roll with a 6, then you add 3 to the damage characteristic of the rifle. You'd still need to wound any enemy failed saves, but if it went through that'd be theoretically all the way up to 9 damage if you rolled well. And as part of the same rule, after the model is fired at its ranged attacks, select one unit that was hit by it, and they've got to take a battle shock test. Obviously lots and lots of stacked rules there, good things happen on 6s, but I would bear in mind there's always the chance of just rolling that fatal 1 to hit, and it's going to be wounding a lot of mid-strength characters on 3+s most of the time, so it's definitely not going to be all that reliable to convert the wound roll. In general, you're going to make your opponent roll a saving throw just over half the time, about 55% chance. so I probably wouldn't overestimate his reliability unless you feel like feeding him command point rerolls, which admittedly could be worth it in the right situation, but would cost you other things elsewhere. A lot of the things that he wants to target as well will often have an invulnerable save too, and if the difference is an alive or dead character, that's also going to be a massive incentive for your opponent to spend command point rerolls to reroll a failed invulnerable save, so he might just have a little bit less reliability in actually killing the characters on his normal rounds. To help get around that though, he does have a once per game shield breaker round that he can use. You have to do this when he selects his target for the Exeter's rifle, so you can't just do it after he's successfully wounded. You will be gambling on this shot actually connecting, and if you manage to hit and wound with that one, then the attack will ignore all saving throws, invulnerable or regular. So this one in particular could give you a very high chance of just sniping out one key character in the enemy army. I feel like this, more than just about anything else, is the one that you could afford a command point reroll on. If you're doing a command point reroll for a very high chance of a dead character, that could well be worth the cost. Overall, definitely seems quite spooky. He should hopefully be safe to get a good few turns worth of damage dealing in, given that he's got lone operative and doesn't need to set up particularly close. He's got a 48-inch range, and could either make opponents just play very cagely with their characters, or have them risk being shot off the table. He will definitely be a lot less used though if he doesn't have good characters to snipe. He might struggle to really recoup his points investment if he's just firing against heavy infantry. Finally, for the Vindicare, he's also got a backup pistol if the enemy gets too close. The Exeter's pistol has similar sort of special rules to the rifle, but is instead 3 shots at strength 5, AP 2 and damage 3. That one could often be the superior choice if you're at close range, particularly if fighting against, say, standard Space Marines with a 3+ save. I think that would usually be better than the Exeter's rifle, though if he is getting this close he is going to be at risk of counter-attacks, and it's not really all that tough to kill. Overall though, a strong little sniper could definitely mess with your opponent's plans and doesn't really cost all that much, plus lone operative in general at long range is kind of annoying to deal with for plenty of armies. Next up, for 85 points, we've got the Culexus Assassin, the Psychic Assassin that could turn off psychic abilities, or give your opponents less chance to cast if they were nearby him. I can't help but think in 10th edition with the changes to the Psychic phase, his roles changed a bit, and maybe isn't quite as pivotal against Psychic units. Compared with the Vindicare, he's got a very similar stat line, still has stealth as well, but trades out infiltrate for deep strike, so you could set him up somewhere within 9 inches of the enemy, or maybe use rapid ingress to get him very close by if you want to get the jump on a key target. As before, he's basically going to be very hard to kill with any sort of psychic attacks, so if you're going against something like Tyrannid Zoanthropes or Thousand Suns, it's going to get a 2+ feel no pain type save against those kind of attacks, so it should be shrugging off the vast majority of damage there. Still though, he's not really quite the tank that he used to be, only being able to be hit on 6s. A lot of regular attacks will just kill him very easily up close. He also seems to have the grenade stratagem as well, which I guess represents those psych out grenades. So I guess it makes sense too, you do have the ability to drop off a bunch of extra mortal wounds if you're willing to pay the CP. As expected, the Culexus is a specialist in handling psychers, though his role has changed a fair bit. He doesn't really do anything to turn off psychic abilities and things, he's only got the big defense against psychic attacks personally, and also gets vastly boosted damage against psychers with his own attacks. I say that the standard profiles he gets are kind of underwhelming if applied to just general units, but of course very potent against psychers and Ds. The Animus Speculum gets 3 attacks at strength 5, AP 2 and damage D3, all shooting at 24 inches and hitting on a 2+. A little bit of anti-heavy infantry fire there, but of course really comes into its own against psychers. You get 6 attacks rather than 3, and you also have the anti-psyker 2+ keyword, so all of those 6 attacks will wound on a 2. That really is quite murderous damage against any unit with psychic. Against any psyker with a 3+ save or a 5+ invulnerable save, you'd average around about 5 or 6 wounds against them, which is pretty strong. So certainly very powerful at sniping librarians and things out of Space Marine units, or could do quite a lot of damage to elite psychic infantry, maybe things like Grey Knight Strike Squads or Tyrannid Zoanthropes, though admittedly both of those would have slightly better durability against these with their invul saves or strong armor saves. In combat he really doubles down on the anti-psyker, kind of slightly lackluster attacks with just 4 attacks at strength 4, AP -2 and damage 2 against most things that he attacks. Not awful, but not stand out for an 85 point character that's kind of fragile. But again, the keywords are pretty big. Anti-psyker 2+ plus devastating wounds means that every wound roll of a 2+ against those will deal 2 mortal wounds to them. So on average there you're getting around about 5 or 6 mortal wounds out of a typical round of combat for him. When you add that to the damage that he might have done in the shooting phase with the Animus Speculum, does mean that he can take a massive chunk out of just about any psyker in the game. I guess the tricky thing might be to get that damage output where he needs to be. I suppose with the Animus Speculum damage you could just have that lurking in your lines, though I suppose you could use rapid ingress to get both the shooting and the combat damage one after the other. just by having him come down somewhere that's just out of threat range for enemy psychers. Just start him just outside of 12 inches and he won't be able to be either shot or charged. Finally, he also has a morale debuff rule, an aura of -1 leadership or -2 leadership to psychers, and once per game in the command phase you can trigger battle shock to enemies within 6 inches. To be fair, that is one of the more useful battle shock debuffs, as happening in the enemy command phase actually could be relevant for things like falling back and scoring objectives and things. It does mean that the opponent has to have started models close to him though. I feel that's probably not going to be good for his long-term health, as only a character with 4 wounds and a 4+ invulnerable save to protect him from death. Overall, I think it's interesting enough. As per normal though, it's just a very big swing between psychers or not. If the enemy's got a majority psychic army or a couple of key units that have got psychers in them, it's probably going to have enough damage threats to easily be worth its inclusion, but if you happen to match yourself against an army that doesn't have any psychers, it's just going to be a bit underwhelming for the 85 points that you've paid. Probably depends on just how many psychers there are in the meta at the moment, and whether those psychers are likely to be on the front line, somewhere where he can get his life-draining touch on them. Next up, we've got the assassin, who doesn't really get assassination, just charges in and kills everyone whatsoever, including his target hopefully. The Eversor assassin still operates a little bit differently from the rest of them in this new edition of the game, moving a little bit faster at 9 inches, and he interestingly also has a 9-inch scout move as well, meaning that you could certainly threaten some first turn charges against enemies that have deployed at least fairly far forward. That's a fairly massive 18 inches of move in the first turn, I guess, and he could even use friends on to advance and charge as well if that makes the difference. Even just moving him somewhere somewhat threatening in the midfield could be quite big though. Move him into a safe mid-board ruin where he can't be shot or charged, and then counter-attack the enemy in turn 2 perhaps. I do quite like the way that he's also kept his deadly demise as well, so he can still have that bio meltdown and hopefully explode over enemy models if he gets lucky. He is only 75 points as well, and that does make him the cheapest of the assassins. When he actually gets there, he brings a whole bunch of anti-infantry and anti-elite attacks. His executioner pistol brings a whole bunch of anti-infantry 3+ shots, 4 attacks at strength 4, AP 0 and damage 1. Even with the anti-infantry, that's not really going to do too much against anything but lighter infantry there. In this edition, his Sentinel array allows him to fire Overwatch for 0 CP, and it says here that you can use that even if Overwatch has been used elsewhere. That would conflict a little bit with the core wording of the stratagem, and might need an FAQ to Overwatch and how that works from Games Workshop. Still though, 0 CP Overwatch with that gun profile still isn't really all that exciting. You'll still be hitting on 6s and a good chance to get no hits whatsoever. His combat's definitely the more exciting thing though. 6 attacks hitting on 2s at strength 5, AP 2 and damage 2, again with anti-infantry 3+, so it'd still punch up a bit against things like Terminators or even tougher infantry out there. And then he combines that with one of 3 different melee buffs chosen in the command phase by friends on, either getting to advance and charge if you need to make a really long charge with him. He could be averaging you charging something around about 20 inches away with that, which is kind of scary. He can give his attacks precision if he wants to have a little bit more focus on actually killing his target as opposed to just killing everything. Or perhaps the most exciting one is that he gets his killing rampage, getting sustained hits 3, so each roll of a 6 will get you an extra 3 hits on the enemy. Very swingy as to whether or not you roll those 6s, but just on average you should roll 1. In theory that's a plus 60% damage just on average with your normal rolling. If you can get friends on activated, his damage output does seem to be okay, around about 5 termagants, 3 or 4 standard Space Marines which seem to be his ideal prey, or around about 1 or 2 Space Marine Terminators. Still though, against most of those that's probably just going to add up to around about how many points that you paid for him. I feel like you still would risk the chance of him just being killed really quite easily in return, given he doesn't really have that big of a defensive profile at all. If you can manage to use him very carefully though, and manages to kill a squad and then survive to do it again, that doesn't seem too bad for 75 points. Finally, last but by no means least, we have the infiltration polymorphine agent that is the Callidus assassin. She's by far the most expensive out of any of them at 115 points, but does come with some really quite interesting rules. Both strong damage output against actually assassinating characters, and some interesting things with jumping on and off the board and command points. Her core rules have a similar sort of profile to both the Vindicare and the Culexus, but doesn't have stealth inbuilt. She has more deployment options with either deep strike, so coming in from reserves, or infiltrators, so could start really far forward if she wanted to. So has perhaps the most flexibility with how she gets up close to her intended prey. Perhaps one of the most interesting for 10th edition missions is her polymorphine ability, which is one of the ones that allows you to take the model off the board at the end of the enemy turn, and then deep strike it back in again in your reinforcement phase in your turn, potentially getting her to a completely different place on the board. And that could be very nice indeed for doing things like tactical objectives. Having things that repeatedly deep strike in different places on the board is pretty handy for that. Could also just be generally nice for picking on isolated enemy units as well, or getting to a place that's hard for the opponent to deal with, maybe having to mess with their movements to get close to get around the lone operative rule. Then for a damage output, she fights with Neural Shredder and Phase Sword. The Neural Shredder is a boosted flamer that's got anti-infantry 2+, strength 5, AP -2 and damage 1. On average, you deal around about 2 wounds to an infantry unit with either a 3+ save or a 5+ invulnerable. Not huge amounts of damage there, but if you roll high on that, that could be a surprisingly big threat to an enemy character perhaps. In combat, she gets the Fights First special rule, which means that she's kind of hard for the enemy to charge with certain elite units, as she gets to attack them with that phase sword before they get to strike. And in combat, she gets to hit with 5 attacks at strength 5, AP -4, and damage 2, with the lethal hit special rule to give her a little bit more punch against tougher enemies. Again, she seems a little bit more tailored to killing medium to lighter characters, as opposed to really heavy ones with big toughness. The high AP in particular is really nice against standard Space Marines. Say against an Intercessor profile should do around about 3 dead Intercessors on average, but the damage output goes down quite a lot if her prey's got an invulnerable save, so say against a Space Marine Captain she'd only get around about 1 or 2 wounds through, probably not quite enough to kill them unless they'd soften them up with the Neural Shredder first. I feel like if she does actually get the jump on a character within a unit, both with the Neural Shredder and then with the Phase Sword attacks, she does have a pretty decent chance of killing a character out of a unit if that is the best way to use her in the game. Finally, and actually making up quite a big portion of her value, is the Reign of Confusion special rule. This one is one of those debuffs that gives you a +1 command point cost to one enemy stratagem, one that they've used already in the game, and then you trigger it to say that future uses will cost you more. To my understanding, this can be used even if she's off the board. It doesn't necessarily specify that she needs to be on the board, and against the right army it could be really quite a powerful ability, particularly if they're a faction that's just got one stratagem that they want to use turn on turn, and this could really deny them an option, or make them pay through the nose for it if they absolutely have to have it. Anything just with a super reliable damage defensive or revival stratagem could be quite good, say rotate Iron Shields for Imperial Knights, resurrecting Custodians, perhaps the 5+ Feel No Pain stratagem for Tyranids, and unlike similar rules in the previous edition, it doesn't seem to be locked out of any of the generic stratagems as well. Hitting the enemy command point reroll with that could be kind of painful to stop them doing reroll charges, or at least pay more for it. You could use it on the 2 command point counter-offensive one to interrupt in combat, or even target enemy overwatch with it if you think that that's going to be a big deal. I think it's the sort of thing that might be more impactful in some games than others, as if the opponent just chooses not to use those stratagems, they can still usually get good value from other ones, but if you do hit a really high value one that is kind of pivotal later in the game, then you're going to deny them some resources, and I feel like the ability in itself is worth a fair chunk of points. In any case, overall I'd say that all the assassins are at least somewhat usable in 10th edition, and in particular the Vindicare and Callidus I think seem quite strong for the cost. The Culexus I'd say is maybe just a little bit too skewed to being massively useful against Psychers, but really not that great against virtually anything else. Maybe means that it's not so great for, say, tournament games where you don't know what you're going to be facing, unless you're absolutely certain that Psychers are going to be everywhere in the meta, and you're going to be playing the majority of your games with armies that have meaningful Psychers in them. For any games where you happen to know that you're facing Psychers, it obviously becomes a much stronger choice. They might get into a little bit of an element of list tailoring there, I guess. The Eversor seems kind of okay for what he does, fairly reliable to get himself into combat with that massive movement, and reasonable enough melee stats if he gets there. I feel like if he doesn't have some ideal prey to go after though, say like some standard Space Marines with 2 wounds, he might just bounce a little bit against tougher things, or be a little bit underwhelming if all he can fight is hordes, as he doesn't kill them quite as efficiently. I can't help but think unless you can somehow get a couple of rounds of combat out of him, and he doesn't just die in return, he might be a little bit on the underwhelming side. The Vindicare though I think is very strong for 80 points, definitely can make certain armies have to play a lot more carefully if they don't want to lose their characters, and that shield break around is particularly spooky. I've seen him used in a fair few army lists, and he can particularly help out knights with their Slay the Warlord quest, where if they can slay the enemy warlord they get a big buff to a bunch of their stratagems and their Feel No Pain type save, even if I'd argue that's probably not the most honourable way for the knights to slay the enemy warlord, by asking some assassin to put a bullet in his head. Finally, the Callidus I think is interesting and has quite a lot of value, The command point increase is worth a fair bit on its own. Then good rules to either help you score victory points throughout the game by jumping around and doing tactical objective type things, or potentially picking on isolated enemy units or trying to take out a key character. I think she does have a pretty reasonable chance of killing an important character out of a unit between the Neural Shredder and the Phase Sword. Definitely adds a whole ton of power and utility, and definitely could be a good choice. I feel like that 115 point price tag is just a little bit on the painful side though, maybe a bit swingy between gamers as to how much she's really worth. As mentioned though, it seems that Vindicare and Callidus seem to be the popular ones in tournament games these days. Let me know what you make of the assassins in any case. Have you had much luck in playing them in the early games of 10th edition, and which ones are your favourites so far? Let me know all your thoughts down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.